Good afternoon. I'm Victoria Barreca, one of your co-moderators for panel one this afternoon, the pandemic pivot, new realities and new responses. Passing it over to you, Joe.
Thank you, Victoria. And I am Joseph Williams. I am Senior Program Director here at the Mid-Atlantic Market for Enterprise. Additionally, I bring about 40 years of pastoral ministry to this work that we are doing here in across the country and across our markets. I want to say that the last discussion is a great segue to this conversation, and I know many of our panelists would agree with that. Right now, many of our churches are facing what we call 40% less attendance. So whether you have 100 members, whether you have 1,000 members, you have now a larger footprint that you have to consider. And one of the things that we do with our faith-based development initiative is to help churches to understand from if you want to say from a spiritual perspective, if the land is the inheritance from the Lord, then the question is, what is the legacy that we're leaving with the land? And we have to really consider what the opportunities exist where we can impact our communities. So let's do this. I want to start abroad in our first question. And Graham Singh, I'm going to come to you. When in light of all that we've just heard, in light of what we just kind of laid the land, put the layout for this conversation, what are some of the things that you are seeing houses of worship in Canada that they're having to do, how they're impacted by COVID-19 and what they've had to do to adjust and move forward to be relevant?
Thank you so much, Joseph, and for the privilege of all the organizers to be here today. Every blessing to you from Canada, where we just turned on our fireplaces. We started getting some snow, and we're sorry every once in a while we send you guys down those cold breezes, but here to bring you a breeze of blessing and encouragement. We're seeing good things happening in Canada. And one of the things I would share with our listeners today is that we have two big categories of churches when thinking about this. I would call these the colonized churches and the equity forward or equity positive churches. And there were some beautiful comments made by all the panelists in the last session about where is Church of Christ and Black majority churches. What does it look like to find those churches that are the historically colonized or colonizing churches? By this, I mean some of the old white cathedrals on the hill. And we have a lot of those in Canada, the Anglican, Presbyterian, United Methodist, Catholic churches. Many of those churches, Joseph, don't have anymore a social license to operate. Meaning we can begin the property development process, but we have to ask, does anybody want to do that extra help? We were talking in the last session about friendly patient capital and perhaps even grant capital. In many cases, those churches don't have that license to be able to ask for that capital from the community. They need to do the work of sharing that equity story with the Black-led, women-led, Indigenous-led community organizations who are those people waiting on the doorstep. And one of the things we've been learning is that when churches open their doors, not as please come and be our partner, our little tenant, but please come and be our major partner in this development process. As we do the Nehemiah work of not just rebuilding the temple. So of course, Nehemiah did not start by rebuilding Jerusalem with the temple. He started by rebuilding the city gates. And I think that's one of the things we've been seeing in Canada, that as we partner with all of those who are rebuilding the city gates, and we seek to rebuild the city gates first as we develop our properties, then we restore that license, in fact, to see the temple rebuilt as well. So that's the order of operations we've been seeing, and I look forward to telling you a little bit more about our work with the Trinity Centers Foundation, my background as an Anglican minister, both in England and here in Canada, and some of the work I've been doing at London School of Economics and decolonization. But at the heart of this is a story of seeing the community come back into the faith-based space, which of course is the very good work of evangelism, discipleship. And who would have thought that property development is in fact good discipleship? Well, as a local church pastor, I can tell you, and I know there are others in this community, and we talk about the state of the movement. In fact, we've seen exactly this. People coming to be more willing to have a spiritual discussion because of the way they've seen us stewarding our assets in equity with them. So those are some of the things we're seeing, Joseph, from up in Canada.
Thank you, Graham. And Nancy, I want to bring the same question to you because I want to, thinking about out west, and I'm specifically targeting these two areas because most churches that have to deal with inclement weather and the like have a secondary plan for worship. So that's why I'm asking you to start out with that question.
Thank you. Yes, we're the St. Francis Center here in Denver, Colorado. We're an arm of the Episcopal Diocese of Colorado and have been a partner with many of the churches in our community. And we were fortunate to have practiced some of the things we needed for COVID, pre-COVID. We were able to use a historic Methodist church that had operated for 113 years. First, for an employment program to serve people who were showing up on the property in the neighborhood, serving those folks. And then during the pandemic, we were actually in redevelopment of that church to turn it into 48 single occupancy rooms, sort of dormitory style housing for people at the very lowest income, the homeless, people who most need housing in our community, which has a very expensive housing market. So our churches and our diocese have been thinking about how do we redeploy those assets? How do we serve people? And right now, we've also turned on our fireplaces and then off again and then on again. And that rebound for people of the uncertainty, the scarcity of resources is something that we're pivoting to address in using our Warren residences as a model and exploring other options as well.
Great, thanks. Pivoting a little bit in terms of the pandemic pivot to Jim and Sherry, would love your insights in terms of the adaptations you've seen houses of worship make and what kinds of strategies and approaches have been adopted and informed those adaptations.
I love the comment that was made in the earlier session about social media being the devil. My interpretation, not their exact words, but every single congregation learned how to Zoom, right? And the first 2 weeks of the pandemic, it was a cell phone held up to at least my church, it was our pastor in front of his fireplace at his house, but in terms of the sort of, using the house of worship kind of thing, I don't know that it really changed anything. I really think the only thing that COVID did was accelerate the transition a little bit and maybe got a few folks who were scared to dive in out of necessity. But I'm really not sure it changed anything in terms of the fact that we've got these huge buildings sitting empty 6.5 days a week and we don't know what to do with them. So I'm not sure it really changed a lot, at least from my perspective.
So from my perspective, we work with churches and nonprofits here in Atlanta, Georgia. And we were working with them prior to the pandemic, and then after the pandemic, we still continue to work with them because it just really depends on what type of church and what stage of life they were at. I think determined how the pandemic affected them. For the stable churches, I think it was an inconvenience to some extent. For the churches that were on the edge, I think it really pushed them over. So the reality is, yes, I think it really did accelerate a lot of things, but perhaps in good ways, as painful as it was, to some extent, like watching churches go through that transition, a lot of things were necessary. They were just waiting for it to happen, right? Like, so, the one church that we did work with has become a demonstration project for the United Methodist Conference here in the North Georgia Conference, the largest conference in the United States. That church was already on a journey of transition, thankfully. And yet the pandemic was an accelerator for something super painful for them. At the same time, they took it on with courage. And so I think the way the pandemic affected each church really depended on the leadership, where they were as a life stage, but also how courageous the leaders were in that process, right? To essentially disassemble and reassemble potentially in very different ways. And I think that the next generation, it really kind of exposed the fact that the next generation, they don't need this much space. They don't need to come to church and sit on a pew on a Sunday only. Like, that's not what they want. That's not what they actually need. And so I think the pandemic was a good accelerator for that. And, you know, talking about faith-based development being this is the time to help churches reimagine what is their future. And so to me, it's a good thing. It was very, very painful. And obviously the amount of casualties that people who left the church never came back, maybe some of it needed to happen in order for the churches who really needed to close and rethink, to really be a community asset, right? And they had lost that sense of it.
I'm gonna do a pastoral pushback here to both of you, because I think that there's something in your answers that is missing, and especially if you look at it from the cultural perspective. The Black church in particular has always been a lifeline, lifeblood to its community. It has been the anchor institution to helping with a myriad of things, whether it is along the health lines, whether it is along socioeconomic opportunities, well, all the things that we can think of to address the social ills. So when you say that nothing has changed, when you hear, like Bishop said, they had to close his church for 16 months, that meant that church was no longer doing what it was doing, even if it was on life support in its community. And so when you talk about generations not needing the building as they did traditionally, while I can concur that there needs to be some, what I call, pivot with the footprint, I'm wondering if we are missing the importance of the anchor institution of the church in its community in order that they can pivot and stay relevant. And so that's the real question here when you think about the strategies. How do you respond to that? Let's go with you, Sherry.
Yeah, I think that I totally agree. I think that churches who were the center of their communities to begin with, Black, white, any color, it was a huge hit. And people craved that coming back. In fact, I think post-pandemic, you will see that the churches that are growing now the most are actually the ones that had that community to begin with. I think it's the problem is where the churches were already dying and they were really not just struggling financially, but struggling to connect with their communities. Those were the ones that I think, that we work the most with, because to some extent, there's two different animals that we would be working with. And to some extent, we're trying to bring them back to the heart of the community. We're trying to bring the community back into their visual presence, and to be able to help them think through how can they serve their brothers and sisters in close proximity, and meet the actual needs and be that community center that they're supposed to be, right? And so I still agree with what you're saying in terms of as an institution, do they need to exist and continue to be that center? Yes. I think that at the end of the day, how does that look could be different.
Jim, your response.
Two things. First of all, when I say it didn't change anything, what I'm talking about is the overall statistical decline that's been occurring for decades in congregations across the country. Interestingly enough, it is, I think, to a certain extent, an American issue, because you look at what's happening in some other parts of the world in terms of the growth of religious communities. But I also think that there are absolutely many, many congregations doing the great work, Joseph, that you talk about day to day in terms of meeting the needs of the community. But there also are way too many churches that are completely inwardly focused, that look at everything as an opportunity to put another butt in another seat and another dollar in a collection plate. I heard this great phrase the other day where they referred to professional Christians, which I thought was just fascinating. But the reality across the country, obviously there's exceptions everywhere, but the reality across the country is churches are shrinking, churches are closing, and people are freaking out, and they become very insular when they freak out that way. And they start to worry about, how do we keep the roof over our heads? So those are the situations I'm talking about. And I apologize if anything I said implied that was true for all churches, because it's not.
Oh, no, I wasn't saying that.
No, I know you're not. I just want to clarify for everybody that's not what either of us are saying.
Mhm.
But there are far too many cases where this is the present reality. And that's that, as David was saying in his opening comments, that's where the challenge is, but that's also where the opportunity is. I come to this work primarily from an entrepreneurial perspective. And so I look at assets that aren't being utilized and say, how can we use them? And maybe it's real estate development. Maybe it's putting that food pantry into your fellowship hall. Maybe it's just taking down the sign at the entrance to the sanctuary that says no food or drink allowed in the sanctuary, Maybe it's just fixing the funny look that the people that have been there for 50 years give when somebody's baby gurgles in the middle of a sermon, right? There are so many barriers that congregations put up to community engagement. And that's really where I start to bang my shoe on the table.
Right. And that's a good point of pivot. Hey, Victoria, help us to shift a little bit, because I think that this leads us to a next question.
Sure. So appreciate what you were saying, Cherie, with reimagining. I think a lot of along those lines with, the people that are being served by the faith institutions and the actual land and property and space that brings them together, and having that property and holding on to that property and reimagining that property in a way that draws people back and serves the community is critically important to the legacy of faith-based organizations. So with that in mind, thinking a bit about the land and the real estate and the walls, or reimagining those walls, Reverend Singh and Nancy, would love to hear from you kicking this question off. Obviously, it's to all of you. But how do you think about the land and the buildings owned by houses of worship and how that's incorporated into this reimagining or this pivot in terms of where they can go for future generations?
I might kick off. I have a staff member who's on my outreach team who said something in a conversation one day that just blew me away. He said, what if you have a church where 500 people are showing up a day, which is the top number that our drop-in center sees every day? And what if you missed it, that was the church? And I think about that I think pivoting what we think of as church and who our congregants are, because I have them, they're with us every day. And they are the congregation member. I'm a little different. I'm not with a church, but we are an extension of our church, and I have the people and we have empty church buildings. And so what I'm trying to do is figure out how I can redeploy assets that we have as a nonprofit to go where the people are. And then we can use the assets that are the physical buildings and things we've always done to support that work, and potentially draw people back to those buildings or redeploy them as housing or some other thing that's needed in the community. And I think we can be the leaders in that. I think we can be the ones saying, hey, come on over, come on down. I have all the people here. Let's see what we can do together, because we need to view them as the congregation and not objects of care or pity or, things we have to do. That's my congregation. I walk through every morning in the day center and I see so much potential, and I want to share that with the churches around me. And I feel like that's life-giving. I think that's reinvigorating, and I'm excited for this sort of whatever this next phase of what we're all doing together post-pandemic or whatever it is. I'm excited for it. I'm ready.
And I really join with you on that, Nancy. And I think that that's actually an argument we can take to government and to other foundations who may not find their roots in a faith-based conversation. They may even have a struggle in connecting with the faith-based conversation. And I think a separation of where we're caring and where we're clearly ministering in Jesus' name from the Bible or from our other faith tradition, if there are those from other faith traditions who are part of the call today, I think it helps us to separate. We can be clearer on both. And by working on love and care in the neighborhood in a way that it allows non-religious actors to come and join, like government and foundations, I think we do very good structure, good governance of our work. And it helps us be clearer when we're meeting together on the weekend for worship. It gives us, again, a social license to be people of faith. And I think where those two mix, there are concerns where people say, hold on, are you handing that food out in order to be able to hand over a Bible tract? Well, look, we've done that at times as the church. And there are times where civic society gets very nervous about that. So being aware of how those things go together, to me, I think is an important part of navigating exactly what you just said. I want to make two further comments. One is about history, and one, I do want to touch back upon graphs for just a second, Victoria. In terms of history, I think it's easy for us to forget. 500 years ago, there's a thing called the Reformation, which is all about property control from the Vatican. The Protestant movement says we need local control of property, and we begin that story. The Reformation movement now splits into two. The magisterial Reformation that take over the buildings in the center of the cities, right? The Lutherans, the Anglicans, they take over the cathedrals. And the radical Reformation that says we need to leave the city and create new communities of faith where we know what we're getting and we're sure that those who are there for the right reasons. That radical Reformation and the magisterial Reformation both join in the task of colonization. And we see all of those churches coming to places like North America. Now, when you talk, Joseph, about the Black church being very committed to care in the neighborhood, I believe you, and I know that that's true. There are others of the colonizing churches that have retreated. And in fact, what Jim is saying is true, where there are times where they are feathering their own nest. They've actually stepped away from that care in the neighborhood. That's part of withdrawing that social license to operate. We also have some of the radical Reformation churches that have tended towards the suburbs and created mega churches. And at times they said, we will care as long as you have a way of driving to our parking lot and getting there. And you better sign up. So actually, we are seeing the Reformation continue to play its way out. And I think as we look at the churches of, do you really care? Are you really integral to the community structure? Or have you begun to separate? To me is a key question. That's my history point. My second point on graphs, sorry to go back just a second, Victoria, on the previous question, but it goes back to this question. Those graphs, and when Jim corrected what he said originally to say, no, hold on, we know all the graphs are going down. I believe a lot of local churches don't. It was discussed in the previous seminar that we don't know our pro formas well enough. I really believe that that's true. And seeing those graphs where we thought, we know we haven't seen those young families grow for a while, but they'll grow one day again, it'll come back, right? It's not coming back. And if those families do come back, they're not tithing because they care about the way we order care in the neighborhood differently. Mm-hmm. So if we follow that graph, that's not changing. If we follow the cost of operating, that has gone up very significantly. We're dealing with major levels of inflation, and our building costs have gone through the roof as well. So the pandemic on all of the graphs of our pro formas have gone the wrong way for doing it on our own and gone the right way for causing us to have to do this work with local communities. And that to me is, again, in the framework of, we've had a lot of discussion of, are these community hubs where charities and nonprofits have a place to hang their hat? Or are these housing projects? To me, these are the absolute core deliverables. And I just repeat what has been said earlier on that. Thanks.
Let me add something, because I want to shift, Jim, to you to this. But let me add something to what you just said, Graham. And that is that the pandemic has forced, let's take inner city churches, for example, has forced inner city churches to look at how it does ministry, because there are certain things that have happened. Gentrification, there's become an affordable housing need in these inner city communities. And the churches now are really the only places where there's an opportunity to help to become solution partners. So to Nancy's point, that the work of ministry has now had to come front center because of the fact that that's the need that is in the community. And so, Jim, when you see that, and in light of what we just discussed, Do you see that there are a cluster of churches like in this region where we are? You and I are in the same region. In this region where we are, there are a cluster of churches that are being more outward minded because they realize that the inward minded approach has not created life, but has actually created a demise.
I don't want to overgeneralize, but my observation is not nearly enough of them are taking the outward perspective. I mean, Nancy, I absolutely love what you said about look in the day center. That's the congregation, right? And, you know, there's another point in Graham's thing about the decline is there's another fascinating aspect to this, which is the human tendency to think that somehow I'm the exception, right? So but hey, look, we actually had a young family come to church this Sunday, so maybe we're going to be okay, you know. And it's, a great friend of mine, Robert Egger, a fantastic social enterprise leader, had a great line. He said, far too often charity is more about the validation of the giver than it is about the redemption of the recipient. And I think that's just a major problem in many, many Christian circles. Yes, there are good people. Yes, there are lots of people doing great work. Yes, there are clusters. But even there, I mean, I worked with a church in a very challenged neighborhood in East Baltimore that set up a food pantry and was shocked to find out that the food wasn't moving. And then they finally came around to realizing that they needed to meet their neighbors where they were and explain to them that this is what a potato looked like in its natural state, and this is how you cook a potato, because these were folks that lived in a food desert and had no experience with potatoes other than the ones that came in a bag with the brand name on them. So there's a lot of stuff that has to happen there to really get folks moving forward. The other thing that I'm a huge fan of is I'm not sure that real estate development is always the right answer either. I think a lot of things like what Nancy's talking about, about using the fellowship hall to run a yoga studio, about using the church kitchen to support food trucks. I think a lot of these conversations end up immediately in knock the building down and build affordable housing. And yes, there's a huge affordable housing need, no question. But at the very least, if you try to come up with an earned income strategy in the meantime, maybe housing is the ultimate answer. Maybe knocking the building down is the ultimate answer. But you can make a couple bucks in the meantime and have a more thoughtful decision about where you go long term. So, there are people. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So go ahead, Jim. Go ahead.
I was just going to say there are definitely people. There are people doing God's work all over the place, no question. But there are also a lot of people doing other things in the name of God's work that aren't exactly how I would define it based on the books that I read.
And I would tell you this, one of the things that we do through our FBDI platform, the training component is very important because it helps them to get to a place where they not only become comfortably conversant in the community development conversation and the process, but they really get to understand by using a process that says, let's do a market analysis feasibility study. Let's see what is the best use of what it is that we can do. In the interim, how are we being good community partners? Because you can't engage in an affordable housing project if you aren't already a good community partner. So part of the challenge is we help churches. Houses of worship is a term we use too, because we're not just in the Christian faith, but we help houses of worship to understand what the steps are and to put the right steps in front of each other so that you just don't go make what I like to call a willy-nilly decision. Because the important thing is that there is a role and a responsibility to be a social enterprise. And Sherry, you mentioned this, when you're working with houses of worship that, and going back to the question that my colleague just asked, what are they looking to do with that land? Like in a place like Atlanta.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that answer is a loaded question because it really depends on who you're talking to. And which community you're in, right? It's so diverse. We're the highest income inequality city in the United States. Like that is, extremely, you could be 2 miles just down the road and it would look completely different. And that answer will be completely different. And I think partly the danger of starting with the question of real estate is that you end up with the highest and best use of the land, but you actually end up with kind of the lowest and worst use of the ministry or of the actual mission. And sometimes you can lose churches in their desperation. So it's not sometimes not even their fault. It could be survival. It could be, or it could be the other way. It could be too much prosperity, right? Like it could be one or the other. And for whatever reason, starting with the land, like when we come in, a lot of people are like, just give us the answer. Like, we just want to know how many, how high can we go? How much can we do? Like, there's all of these things that, come with technical assistants and architects and all the people that we work with and love working with. At the same time, if they have not got a rock solid North Star as a church in the community, start doing real estate is a very dangerous move.
Yeah.
Can I just add an academic point here real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
To what you were saying, because they put the doctor here, so I guess I'm playing the academic role today. Sherry, there's another thing here, which is that American capitalism says that the highest and best monetary answer is automatically the answer, right? And I think there's a whole other issue there philosophically that needs to get unpacked in this conversation that says just because it can bring you the most dollars doesn't mean it's the right thing to do, whether it's selling tickets to a concert that you can't use or knocking down a church building. It's a really fascinating cultural aspect that really gets jumped down in this.
I want to jump in on you. Joseph, do you mind if I jump in there?
Yeah, but Graham, I'm gonna give you a chance to come in. I think, Jim, one of the things that what you say is, and Graham, here's where I want you to start thinking about this, because Sherry, you raised up something. The key for a house of worship is that what we call that early pre-development process called discernment, and being able to understand where it is that they need to be going as it relates to the inheritance of the land and the legacy they're supposed to leave. So, Graham, when you think about that and you think about the fact of where you're going, because you don't start with real estate. You already have the real estate. You start with the mission and what are we going to do with where we are. And so how does that discernment process describe that and walk that out in helping a house of worship to think about a pandemic pivot?
Joseph, thank you so much for that. And I'm loving this discussion, everybody. It's wonderful to we are called to join in God's creative process throughout the whole world. That's our calling as human beings. And Jesus comes to explain to us how we're going to do that in relationship with each other, where we're constantly going to cause damage to each other, and we need to live in community. So Christian community in the work of creation is such a beautiful part of our calling. When we look at capitalism, and Jim, you mentioned American capitalism, I think we'd find capitalism is actually the same all across the world and throughout all history. And
yeah,
what
we do a particularly good job of it.
Has done incorrectly is incorrectly cost. And by not costing our harm to the environment, capitalism runs amok. In not costing the cost and the harm of property development, we're missing and not understanding why that Black church that's caring for the neighborhood or the Episcopal church that's actually running this food shelter, we've not actually costed densification and the building of a city. We've not done our Nehemiah job very well. An example of this is a project called at Harvard Business School called Impact Weighted Accounts, where Sir Ronald Cohen has led the project there, looking at the overall cost of companies. So I'll give you an example. Coca-Cola, great company, lots of profit, nice drinks. There's also a cost, right? They use plastic bottles, they consume water, there's carbon emitted in the transport of those drinks. But what's the biggest cost of Coca-Cola? It's diabetes. It's one of our number one costs of our healthcare system. So if we actually look at the cost of Coca-Cola, we would factor in the cost of treating diabetes. That's the argument that Impact Weighted Accounts is making. if we're good Christians, it means we're good actors in the economy, and we will correctly cost our work in economic development. And when Sherry says that, I want to just say it a little bit stronger and say, there's an easy answer to how to develop your church property under highest best use. Demolish a church and build high-end condos. Wherever you possibly can, build as many as you can, as luxuriously as you can. You are definitely going to get the most amount of money, and you will play by accounting rules in doing so. But we're not playing by only accounting rules. We have objects of our charities, and we have kingdom values. And in making those decisions well, thinking about those, we're there. So, Joseph, to go back to your question, to me, it is exactly in working with a partner like Enterprise. And I don't think that a congregation should or can do this on their own. You need to have a trusted guide who is not from within your congregation, but who is an entity that you trust. And that entity must spend as much time with your neighborhood as it does with you as the congregation. Because guess what? You are the only people who are convinced that you own that property. The rest of the neighborhood think that they, in part, own that property with you. Why do they think that? Because sometimes there was an initial gift of land. There's been a historic tax exemption the whole community is part of. And actually, you've told everybody in your fundraising over the last 100 years that this is a community property. So doing the work of listening well, understanding highest best use will always give you a condo tower, if it can get away with it. And doing that work of listening to what does the community need, along with what does your congregation think is going to happen, with a trusted guide who is specifically set up to do this. And I loved what was said in the last session, not through a document signed by an attorney or proposed by an attorney that's the developer's attorney. We need to get to a higher standard and make sure you have all the tools necessary, the training, the legal work, to make sure that that is done. That listening stage is done professionally, technically, and with that ownership layer, historical layer in place as well. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll jump in for a moment. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Sherry.
Yeah, that's okay. I was just going to reiterate that, that pre-development, visioning, discerning stage, it is actually the church's greatest hope to some extent, right? Like most landowners, they are going to look at the highest and best use like that. I mean, every other landowner, so the reality is that if anyone's going to do it, has the capacity to think about something differently, to reimagine a different goal, actually it's the church, right? Like actually it's houses of worship, at least one of them, right? There are other nonprofits out there, but as people of faith, like that's actually our calling. So to me, that's why we all do this work, right? Like I'm assuming, like what David Bauer said, this is calling. This is not a real estate, kind of career to some extent. So just wanted to reiterate that, like that is so important, and I'm so glad that the Enterprise is supporting that, because the reality is it's not just a numbers game. And even with the tension, we work with a lot of Black churches and a lot of Black communities. The tension is that actually for that community, wealth building is so important, right? So the money matters. So, and it's not always just about saying no to money. Sometimes it's saying yes to money, but at the same time, there is such a hard tension about who does the money go to, how does it get spent, who does it benefit, and 100%. That's why when Graham said that the communities need to be involved, the communities really, really, really need to be involved. So it's not just a church decision or church leadership decision. It's the community's decision together with the leadership of the church, understanding what is this particular church's role in this particular context and place is a discerning process that cannot be missed.
Yeah, I really appreciate those comments and a lot of themes coming out of today thus far in terms of the importance of the discernment, a North Star, knowing what that North Star is, knowing what you don't know, and that's okay. There may need to be more gaps that you fill in to kind of support that North Star, and balance is everything. You're going to need to balance the mission with the economic returns, with the service to the community, the legacy for the congregation. those are not easy things to balance all at the same time. And it takes that ongoing discernment process to really gel that. And also, Sherry, what you were just saying about the community is so important. With that, I wanted to shift the gears a little bit to Nancy to talk to us a little bit more about the stakeholders, to talk about the community and thinking beyond the congregation. Who are the key stakeholders? How do faith organizations begin to think about, with those that aren't kind of so fluently connected to the church already or to the house of worship? How does a faith organization connect within its community, think about the stakeholders in a different way, and engage with those stakeholders to, again, reimagine and move from that reimagining to service to the community and to service to that congregation?
Yeah, I'm going to sing the praises of pre-development also. That's a great theme today. And having a little bit of resource with it. So some of those pre-development grants that can allow the community to take that time, because oftentimes the pressure of doing something with the asset or moving quickly might propel you faster than your stakeholders are ready. And so in our property, which is located in the Capitol Hill district of Denver, we had a moderator who worked with community groups who there was a community council, there were a couple of neighborhood associations, and we brought them together for really moderated sessions because people were so fearful about the housing that we were proposing and the people who might be in the neighborhood. And there were some things that happened in the beginning of our project because we launched during the pandemic. We were quite strained for staffing and adjusting our models. So there were things that sort of led the community partners to feel those fears were justified, and we just stayed in it. You have to stay in it and bring those folks along. I love that frame that it has been portrayed to them. We portray it all the time as a nonprofit in Denver. We're your nonprofit. We're here for you. And so to bring them with you is a lot of work. It's a lot of time and effort and genuine listening and caring about their perspective, that they're being fearful for a reason. It's their family, it's their home, it's their everything. And so just trying to have that, giving everyone that moment of grace and that time to sit together and allow their fears to be expressed and then to address them. I just think that's extremely important. But the other stakeholder group that we have is sometimes our constituents, our homeless folks, will not come to a property because they're fearful of moving out of where they've been. And so also holding that space for the people who might be using your service or coming in, go to them, go where they are, ask them questions, listen to them, do that work as well. Those are equal important stakeholders from the beginning. A funny story is when a church I was working with did an elder housing program, we interviewed all the elders in the church and asked them, like, what should go into the apartments and how should they look? And so we did it, and we went back to all the elders and we said, there, we did it. We put everything in that you wanted. And they said, oh, that's great. That's for the old people. So when the old people move in there, they'll love all those amenities. And we were like, wait, no, that's you. We were designing for you, but they, over time, a few of them moved in, and then the whole thing started. But I think just really staying in touch with your constituents is important.
I think the cities that themselves and officials are a great resource and a great stakeholder as well. Sometimes they might work against you, but to some extent, they're kind of an unavoidable stakeholder. And best that they are your partner, because the reality is that a lot of churches are not very in tune with their city officials, right? Some are, but some aren't. And when they don't really know what their own city, where they're headed, and what their vision is, it's very hard to be in line with that, right? Like to understand your context. And so, for example, the United Methodist Church project in College Park, we wanted to do affordable housing, and it was a low income tax credit deal, on one component, on one side of it. And the city actually said, no, they were like, this is a low income community that needs, good, high quality, affordable housing. And we were like, why would you say no when this would be, providing high quality housing to some of the people who would be moving out? And they were like, well, we're at 81% rental community. We want you to build for sale houses, right? Or for sale condos. And we will only let you do the low income rental as long as you provide opportunities for ownership. And we were like, okay, we got it, right? And so at that point, the church had to sell. The church may or may not really needed to sell, but at that point, they were willing. They listened. So to their benefit, to their credit, they actually listened and said, okay, we're going to let go of, our Sunday school building. We're going to let go of the parsonage. We're going to let go of land in order that others in our community can benefit from this long term. And we put a nonprofit arts organization there who became an owner as well. Like, all of these things are going to change that narrative. But the stakeholders are key to understanding that. And cities are a great resource.
And since you raised up a point that is, I talked about earlier, the being relevant, means being connected to your community and your elected officials. Being relevant is understanding what the inheritance of the land is in order that you can create the legacy. I know that we are rounding toward the end of time, and so what I want to do is I want to give each of you an opportunity to answer this question for me. What advice or feedback can you offer to congregations seeking to replicate successful pivot efforts? You got 98 seconds, so we'll give you 2 minutes. Jim, let's start with you.
My advice would be to look at the assets that you have and see how they can produce income before you have any conversations with anyone who is looking to do real estate development. See what sort of money you can make from renting out what you have, from reusing what you have. At the very least, that buys you time. At the highest level, it ends up with what Nancy said, which is if you got a whole new congregation of folks that actually want to be there.
Well, I'm going to ride a little bit on that, just since we're really short on time. But that is literally the first step that we do. Like, we go in and we ask them, what are you doing in your space now? Don't talk about all the other things that you could do. If you don't know how to use it, the reality is that if you build something else, you probably won't know how to use it again. Right? Like, so we come in and we activate and we work with the community to design something and reimagine something that actually it's co-created, right? Like, and then that what you're building and you're putting tons of money and effort and time into actually works. Like, actually is something that the community wanted, that they actually needed, and it actually works with your community. So that, to me, I think, is the one thing.
Nancy?
I think those two would be the top of my list as well. I think of it as try before you buy. So host programs, see how that impacts the neighborhood, the use, try some different things. Also try to predict where you think your congregation is going. Are you looking at serving elders? Are you looking at serving families and children? Sort of try to predict where you think you're heading. And then the second one is find your friends, find your Sherry in your organization, in your town, find your development team. We have a team that's worked with our agency on now 3 different projects. And so they know us, they understand us. They also know the community. And I would say, look for that.
Yeah. Reverend Graham.
2 quick things. Be willing to listen to the harm that's caused by communities of faith in your neighborhood. It may not be yours. You might be the good guys, but there might be others who have ruffled feathers or have caused distrust. And that pre-development process will bring up the harm. It gets into the city, the foundations. And if you listen to it and acknowledge it, you can move forward and find a way. Second is, know your neighbors. And when I think about Sherry's story where the city says, no affordable housing here, we insist that you build condos. Now is a good time to know the church across the street, because they may well be the best place to partner with the money you're going to make there. And watch out for the nasty E word coming at you of endowment, because some accountant will find out that you had that money and will want to stuff it under a mattress. This is not a good time to do that. You need to know who your neighbors are, because somebody up the road from you could really use your partnership to come with those funds. And this is a time where sometimes you ever have those little jokes where somebody says, we're the Episcopal Church, we don't hang out with the Methodists, we had a schism with them a long time ago, that's the way we work. You think somebody new coming to your church has no idea what that meant. They're not part of that conflict. In fact, your churches, people in places of faith, communities of faith, those are old battles. They're gone long in history. Now is a time to be very, very proactive in partnering with the wealth that we can release from the land in order to put it back into the land in that neighborhood. Don't export it. Don't join the extractive movement. We're going the other direction.
Yeah, and look, I want to thank you all for your time that you're giving us on behalf of my colleague Tori and myself and Enterprise Community Partners. I will share with you that as we work with houses of worship in the trenches, one of the things that you're going to have to understand is the importance of looking at your community well beyond yourself. So I will say that you have to consider the non-church folk who are not a part, but they are a part of your community because they're living right next door to you. You want to make sure that you are considering a process that will help you to move forward, that includes discernment, that includes understanding your stakeholders, that would include making sure that you are really dotting your I's and crossing your T's. You've heard it said that development is a journey. It's not a sprint. And you have to make sure that you are really, really looking at the right things so that you will be able to make a difference and an impact in your communities. Thank you for your time. Thank you, panelists, for this wonderful discussion. We appreciate you all greatly. God bless you.
We'll follow up on that, Joe, and just thank everybody for your time, your insights, really invaluable today. I learned a lot as well and really inspired by your words. So we have a lot of work ahead of us as an organization and as a movement. So looking forward to rolling up our sleeves and doing more of this together. I want to take 2 housekeeping notes. One, the participants, the registrants for this event today will receive an email from Enterprise with a link to the recording of the event, as also a link to the faith-based development guide that was described earlier. We are now going to pause and take a 5-minute break. So for those who are joining us virtually, you have a 5-minute stretch break. We will be right back in 5 minutes to kick off panel 2. Thank you, everybody.